this works, I think it does. Good morning. It is still morning, everyone. Great. Thank you for that warm introduction. This is a lovely space to sit, and I think as an Australian, and this is an Australian panel with an Australian identity, we very much like sitting in the outdoors, so happy to be here. I will start this with two things, and the two words. One, of course, is Namaskara. We're sitting here in Bangalore, and I'm recognising Kannada language. But I'll also use the word Yumalundi, which is an Australian Indigenous language. And if we were meeting in Australia, we would start this discussion, and we would start any sort of major gathering, and I work with the Australian government, so this is part of my role, with an acknowledgement of country. And an acknowledgement of country in Australia is an acknowledgement of the Indigenous connection through land, through culture, through living memory, and through existing and ongoing connections. It's a something that is... Oh, louder? I'm so sorry. I'll be loud and... good, thank you, you're giving me thumbs up. My apologies. I would start with an acknowledgement of country. That is about Indigenous connections to land, to country. Country is more than one country in Australia. There are many countries. And the purpose of that is two things. It is about current connections, but it is also recognising elders of the past. And so Australia has a very challenging history with its Indigenous people, and frankly a history that is quite shameful in parts. So there's an ongoing process of reconciliation, and as an Australian government official, my role is to draw out that and to point out that acknowledgement of country is something that we will always do when we meet in Australia. So if we're in Canberra, it would be Ngunnawal country. As part of our panel today, two of our authors are Indigenous heritage, and that is what they bring to their literary traditions and their novels. And then one of our authors is very much embedded in Western Australian wheat belt and land. So the discussion we're going to have is very dynamic. It's going to be about country. The last thing I will do is acknowledge the Indigenous people of this area. So our traditions here are also traditions we bring to India. So any Indigenous people here from the region, I acknowledge you as well. With that, we're going to start our discussion. And I think, if I may, we're going to bring a very quick question to bring us into Indian literary tradition. So I'm going to ask Julie, Antonia and Philip, all three of the authors, if there are any Indian authors that have particularly inspired your work as you've been here or in the past. So Julie, we might start with you.
Well, 20 years ago it would have been Salman Rushdie, who is still magnificent. But now my absolutely favourite is Arundhati Roy. And Mother Mary comes to me, breaks my heart every time I try to read. So it is a great pleasure to be here in India where Arundhati Roy lives. Thank you.
For me, we were given this question a couple of days. I was thinking about it, and I think the one that stuck with me, and I've read it a couple of times now, is The Shadow Lines by Amitav Ghosh. Something about the way that there's a traumatic centre to that novel, and it just kind of echoes along these shadow lines and how these define our lives in all sorts of hidden and submerged ways. That's something that's quite close to my own way of thinking and my scholarship as well.
I've got quite a few, but I'm restricted to a couple. One of my favourite authors runs this festival, Shiny Anthony. I met Shiny about 12 years ago, and I heard her do a reading, and I was absolutely stunned. I really like her work. She shouldn't be running festivals. She should be writing, you know. So, she's one of my favourite because of the way that she writes. Her prose is so captivating. But I also have a friend who was a writer, journalist. He's the chair of PEN, especially the authors and the journalists that are imprisoned. Salil Tripathi. He's a friend of mine, and he's a very good writer. He writes for Indian Times and the London Times. He lives in London, and he also facilitates India Bridge, or is it Bridge India, which is an intellectual think tank in London. Salil is really worth reading if you come across his work.
Thank you. They were very short, sharp answers. Thank you. Julie, I'm going to turn now to you with a question. To set this up I live and work in Bangalore. This city has a real focus on language in many respects. Kannada is the language that is by the majority of the state, and so it appears on a lot of signage. There's a real push to make sure Kannada is featured, but there's also many other languages in this state and many other languages in India. Your work in Benevolence and Compassion, your 2 novels, I know you've used Darug language, the language of your country. How do you find that novels is a way of bringing light to language, reactivating language? What's your experience of that with Darug?
Look, I think Darug language is the language of the Aboriginal people of the Sydney Basin, and we were the first Aboriginal nation to be invaded in 1788 by the British, and so therefore it's like ground zero in terms of culture and language. But the present generations of Darug descendants, like myself and like my father, we fight to kind of retain the elements of that language that we've got left, and often it's what's been recorded through linguists maybe 150 years ago, and they're often just word lists. But I always make an absolute effort to make sure that those words are included in the stories of my Indigenous characters, because they would have actually spoken Darug language. I cannot speak fluent Darug, but I can certainly bring the language back as much as I can through the historical stories and the crime novels I write, to bring those languages back, but in a way that they are consistent with people who are reading in English or other languages, that they can actually understand what the word means by the very context in which it's needed. We need to maintain our Indigenous languages as much as we possibly can. Yeah.
Thank you, Julie. Philip, I'm going to turn to you now. Your work, Scream Black Murder, is a crime novel. Why for you is crime fiction the genre you've chosen for social advocacy? How does that become your chosen path, and how does that work for you?
Look, I remember the day when I decided I was going to be a writer. I wasn't always a writer. You know, I had a whole career in film and television and advertising, and I was working on a film in Canada, on the Haida Band Indians. They're the people from Vancouver in Canada. And I realised when we finished filming that film that I realised when I was... is that okay up the back? Yeah. Is that better? I realised when we'd finished filming that film that I knew more about the Haida Indians than I did about my own people back home. And I really got angry about that. I'm reasonably well educated, but there was nothing about my people and hardly anything about Aboriginal history at all in Australian history. We call that a kind of a whitewashing of what really happened there. So when I went back to Australia, I'd lived away for 12 years, and when I went back to Australia, one of the first things I did was to start the research on my own people, the Kamilaroi people, who are really like about 500 kilometres from Sydney, west of Sydney. I didn't know how I was going to write that book, or Scream Black Murder. I chose Scream Black Murder because I looked at as a crime novel, I looked at who was going to read this. You know, I didn't want to write a non-fiction book, so I looked at romance. Well, they sold 28% of the market. Crime was 38% of the market. So it was either going to be one of those two. So I chose crime.
I'm glad you didn't choose romance.
Yeah, I had to. But it was not really a whodunit, because I chose I wrote the villain in first person in italics, so you knew who did it immediately in my book. So it was, how did they catch this guy? My characters were Indigenous characters, and so I could reveal a lot about Indigenous life in the present day. My first book was historical, so that's basically how it got to crime.
It's your life of written crime. I hadn't realised you had an advertising background. So when you talk about, choosing what is effective, I think that must be, part of the credentials you bring, right? Yes. That makes sense to me. Yes. Tony, your work, like nothing on this earth, a literary history of the wheat belt, that is a particular part of the state of Western Australia, which on a map is almost half of Australia, even though we call it the West. that novel explores the relationship between Western Australia's wheat belt and literature. So the question I have for you then is, how has land, environment and the geography of Australia shaped our literature, and particularly Western Australia's literature?
Well, the settlement of Australia was brought about through the issuing of land to settlers. That's how a settler colony works. The land that they are given is land that belonged to Indigenous people, so it's contested land all the way through. So on the one hand, you have traditional Aboriginal sovereignty of their country, and standing next to that is a new and a kind of powerful myth, which is the myth of settler belonging. And at the heart of that is the farm. So the farm becomes this place where this land, which has been appropriated, gets sanctified through the act of farming. So there's a whole story around in Australian literature about turning land to use. And farms really have two main purposes. Like on the one hand, it has a material purpose, like produce wheat. So West Australia is a massive wheat exporting region, and other parts of Australia produce large agricultural surpluses. But the farm also has a personal and psychic role in the nation. For settler people, it's the act of turning the land into food that helps ground them in their identity. So that I was interested in how that all worked within Australian literature. We have a kind of a bush tradition in Australia, just like there are similar kind of settler myths in Canada or New Zealand or South Africa as well. So I was interested in how that works in Australia. The other thing that happens with Australia is that Europeans come to Australia and they try to relate to it in ways that make sense in Northern Hemisphere Europe, and they make no sense at all in Australia. Like in my particular part of Australia, which is the land of the Noongar people, they have 6 seasons. So we have 3 different summers, and that actually makes a lot of sense if you ever live in. We don't really have a spring and an autumn and all these sorts of things. So land has really shaped it. And the other thing about the land in Australia is it's comparatively infertile, at least for things like wheat, which means you can grow things there, but you need a lot more land, which the effect of that is the land is very empty of people and only sustains people at a very low density. So we have kind of isolation is another really important way in which geography has influenced the way that Australian literature has been written.
Thank you. When we sit here in India and think about the concept of small population isolation, but this is a huge country, and it is a country with remote areas. And I know even the physical landmass of Western Australia and parts of India were once Gondwana land. So actually the soil of both countries was joined, and some of the geology of both countries is common. So there's an ongoing scientific process that actually examines the connections between the two countries in their physical terms. Julie, I'll turn back to you now and talk about your origin as a playwright. So working with remote Indigenous communities, small communities, becoming a professional playwright, and then becoming a novelist and working on crime novels. How has your heritage and history as a playwright shaped your experience as a novelist and an author?
Well, being a playwright is much more exciting than being a novelist. You're part of the theatre company. You get to stand around in bars with sexy actors in tight black jackets, and it's a wonderful life, really. A novelist is a different story. You could spend 2 or 3 years in a darkened room in your slippers with a packet of biscuits and deep depression. So all of those who are planning to be a novelist, think very carefully about this career. But I don't think I'd be the novelist I am today if I hadn't had 20 years of writing plays, and especially in Aboriginal communities, in order to empower young Aboriginal people and children into writing their own stories. I work with improvisation and making giant masks and costumes in order for them to speak their own stories. There's no point me walking in with a copy of Shakespeare and expecting them to appreciate that. They wanted to tell their own stories about them and their land. Or sometimes they wanted to tell stories like Dracula and the Indians, depending on what was the choice of those particular young people. But I learned to work with those communities and to listen very much to the vernacular, which I then was able to use when I began to write plays. But I've always had a very political nature, and as I became an adult playwright, the very first adult play I wrote was about Aboriginal deaths in police custody. And while it's a very heavy political subject, in Australia we have the highest rate of Aboriginal incarceration in the world. And 4 times as many young men of Indigenous descent will be in prison compared to people of English, Irish or other descents. But the politics of our writing is very important, but I find if I want to get a political story out there, if I write a crime novel or I write a historical novel, and it's going to encourage more readers to come into those particular stories. But I write about the history of Australia in its context of colonialism and its impact on Indigenous people. But, you know, they're fun. Read them.
And we should have had the books at the front on a promotional
I wish.
stand. But I know there is a bookstore. Thank you. Philip, I'm going to come back to you. You touched on, in your previous comments, why you chose the genre you did, but the kinds of mainstream narratives and assumptions and presumptions about Aboriginal Australians that you were tackling. What were some of those? What would you like the audience to be aware of? What's on your list at the moment?
Pretty much the same as what Julie just said. I was asked by the Australian government to rewrite the reports on Aboriginal deaths in custody. There were volumes and volumes of this report. It was a Royal Commission, and I was asked to, it's all in legalese, so I was asked to write it in a language that Aboriginal people could read. Unfortunately, I found 2 of my relatives in there that were beaten by cops. One of them was on the street and the other one was in a cell. So that was very important. I wrote about that. The history, the white armband, the black armband of history, the whitewashing, it's all quite well documented now, but it wasn't when I started writing. We got people like Julie stepped in and helped that. There aren't a lot of Aboriginal writers who are published. It's very hard to get published because we write the unpleasant stories. And that's why we write them in the genre that we do, to make sure that people read them, and that these are messages, usually in my work, they're carried by the characters. They're living the daily lives. And, you know, if there's a murder or 2, well, that makes it even better, you know.
Thank you. Julie, your work, as you said, you work with historical fiction. How do you, as an author, as an artist, but also as someone with a message, strike that balance between historical fact and fiction? How do you thread that needle in your work?
When I first wrote the first novel of a trilogy that will be completed, I hope, by next year, trouble is when you go out as a writer and you start telling people you've written a trilogy and you're going to write a trilogy and you've only written 1 book, it means you've got to write 2 more, which is often a challenge. Initially, I did a huge amount of historical research, a lot of libraries, a lot of microfiche. It was kind of before AI and the miracle of the internet to a certain extent. And that is what sustained me, lots of time in libraries and in talking to Indigenous elders is where a lot of stories came to me. And I was privileged enough to be employed by a professor of history at the University of Sydney to do a 3-year historical research of the history of Aboriginal Sydney, which is still a live website, which is free all over the world. And I was able to go out to lots and lots of communities and interview people and make videos, and that gave me the fundamentals to begin to really understand Aboriginal history in Sydney, which had barely been written down. If you actually tried to find a book about it, everything stopped about 1850, and there was nothing else. So it was that privilege of being able to do that with actually Indigenous people and with elders. And but now, you know, a lot of the time on book 3, I make a lot up, which I hope people won't mind. I do hang it on historical accuracy because it's important to do so, but I'm confident enough now to kind of just plunge on in and feel that I know the history already and I can just work on being a creative writer. And I'm thinking that the second half of the book I'm going to set in India, because I'm really enjoying being in India and I like the history of India. And there are great connections between Australian history and Indian history through the colonial, especially the moving around of troops. 1857, the English troops who fought against the sepoys were then sent to Australia to massacre every single Aboriginal tribe they could find all around Australia, and then they were sent on to New Zealand to fight the Maori Wars, and eventually in the 1890s off to South Africa to fight the Afrikaans, all to ensure that the British held on to the money and held on to the land and held on to our assets. I'm a bit political, aren't I?
This is a conversation where we want perspective, so I'm happy to have it. Julie, on those connections between Australia and India, and in terms of place names as well, there's a town here in Karnataka called Mangalore in its British title. There's a very small country town in Victoria called Mangalore, and that is a direct product of those connections. There was a British officer, I believe. He ended up in the US and then ended up in Australia and purchased some farmland. He had enough money. I think it was his brother that had some role at the station in Bangalore, so he named his farm in Australia Mangalore, and it's still a tiny, tiny speck of a town in Victoria. It really is, I think, a few houses in a crossroad, but that direct connection, you can see it play out. I think there's also one in Tasmania for the same reason. So when I went to Mangalore, and found that connection fascinating. Tony, I'm going to come to you now, if I may. The work you've done, some of it is about identifying trends in Australian literature. So this question is as big or as small as you want to take it. You've looked at trends in Australian literature from a historical perspective, but there's also trends in Australian literature, where you see things moving. What for you are some of those important themes? Where do you think Australian literature is, or perhaps even should be going?
Well, I might answer that question by using the example of the people next to me. So, and I think this is a trend. What's interesting about both Julie and Philip is that they've written two kinds of novels. One is historical novels, kind of in which the Australian frontier is reimagined. So, lots of Australian historical fiction is about the moment of settlement. Every time you tell that story, you effectively re-narrate the purpose of the country and ground the present Australia in a certain kind of myth or foundational story. So they've rewritten the frontier in their historical work. And then on the other hand, they've written crime stories. So a lot of the work, I guess the ideological work in Australia is to divorce crime from history. So in lots of ways, the founding of Australia is, but let's just say it takes considerable judicial acrobatics to take a situation where you steal someone's land and declare that it is legitimate property. So there's kind of crimes that happen right through the frontier. And I think what happens in these crime novels written by Indigenous people is that we're reintroducing the element of crime to the domain of history. By history, I mean the present as well, actually, because we're the products of that history. So I think that's been a trend. Why crime? I think crime, if you think about the general purpose of Australia and other countries, it's generally to evade moral responsibility, whereas crime insists on moral responsibility. I've just read a really, really good book, which is set in the Tasmanian frontier, and it's called My Heart at Evening, and it's a play on The Heart of Darkness, and it's a crime novel, and it's about investigation of a suicide in Tasmania. This is a real historical event in the 1820s, and you follow along this investigation of this particular, because the governor suspects that it's not a suicide, something else has gone on. So you follow all the way through this investigation, like, oh, what kind of whodunit, how did this young architect commit suicide on the lands of the Van Diemen's Company? And it took me all the way to read to the end to realise the point of this book was not the investigation. It's not what the detective was obsessed with, which was the suicide of this architect. It was everything that he was not seeing, because this was the epicentre of Australian genocide, actually. So I think there's been a trend where crime has been introduced to history as a way of establishing the grounds for historical responsibility. That's been a really fascinating thing, and I have to thank both Philip and Julie for helping me see that.
Thank you. Mike. As a student, my favourite subject and still is was history, and I do remember at some point in university thinking, I've learned about the French Revolution 3 times, and I still haven't learned anything about Indigenous Australia, or to be honest, Australian history in any depth or sophistication. I think both of those pieces. And look, that's a little while ago now, but it's not that long ago. Literature is part of the way that's changing. I think curriculums are also hopefully changing and becoming a bit more fulsome as we take pride in our history and then examine all parts of it. So it's good to hear. I'm going to come back to one question to share amongst all of you, if I may, to sort of finish this, which is, from your perspectives, how can literature help support Australia's reconciliation journey? That, again, is a very big question. Take it as it is meaningful to you, but we are here today talking about the role of literature. We're tackling difficult issues, and we are bringing light to some of the journeys going on in Australia. So I might start first with you, Philip, if I may.
I'm sick of that word, it's kind of lost its effectiveness. Reconciliation. In Australia, I've been talking about reconciliation since I was a kid. I don't know what that means anymore, but I know it's extremely complex. I know some of the people that are sitting in these rooms in Canberra trying to figure out ways of reconciliation. Because of its complexity, I really got interested in complexity. I'm a member of a institution in Arizona called the Santa Fe Institution. Well, they have several Nobel Prize winners looking at the very same problem of people, institutions, and how culture is affected by government changes to any country, like a colonised country, to India, to Australia. It's to put that into some sort of fiction. I would think we'd have to go into science fiction. And I looked at people like Aldous Huxley and George Orwell coming through, and I hope there'll be Aboriginal authors.
Thank you.
Yeah. Look, I'd like to say something about this too. Even though the word reconciliation we've used in Australia again and again, and recently we had a referendum about Indigenous rights, and there was a resounding no, that there was not going to be a special voice to Parliament, even though our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, was very, very strongly in favour of having a special organisation, a voice to Parliament, which consisted of Indigenous people. But even though we tried very, very hard to get that across the line, in the end, I couldn't see that a settler nation, the majority of Australians are settlers from somewhere else, would vote for Indigenous rights, and in fact my instinct was correct. But nevertheless, in the Australian Parliament now, every year at the beginning of the opening of Parliament, there is a smoking ceremony and a welcome to country performed by Indigenous people. And this is a really important, significant step. And there's also an Indigenous flag and the flag also for the Torres Strait Islander people that sit right alongside the Australian flag with its ubiquitous British flag in the corner. So these are great developments in Australia and very important ones and fairly recent. And I commend, especially the Albanese government that we have now for bringing these welcomes into Parliament and to be considered as the main part of how we behave. And in fact, the consular officials we've been meeting and travelling with here in India make an absolute effort of making sure that they recognise and acknowledge Aboriginal people in an opening speech. So I think we are moving forward, and it will not always be bleak. And that human beings can come to terms with each other and be friends with each other. I don't know if that's going to happen in the Middle East. I just pray that one day that will happen also.
I mean, just as there was a imposition of kind of farming practice and ideas of seasons and so on into Australia, a similar thing happened with literary forms. So we had plays and poetry and an idea of what they were meant to be in Australia, because it was created in the late 19th, early 20th century. There's a strong romantic strain within Australian literature. What I think is really important though is that, and what Indigenous people have brought to Australian literature probably really since the post-war period, is new voices. So even when the original playwrights like Jack Davis writing in the 70s, and they're using forms which seem familiar to us, maybe social realist plays, they're different because on stage are Aboriginal people speaking the way that Aboriginal people do. So the fundamental realignment at the level of how we hear, actually, how we make sense of ourselves, and it's a matter of hearing the different ways in which people speak. There's also, in a writer like Alexis Wright, we have a kind of voice of country. So this was, I read a writer like Alexis Wright and I learned something fundamental. It's not my belief system, but I can see a world in which the country knows, and that's quite different. I live in a alienated modern way. I see land being used for certain purposes. I see certain, natural scenes that I think are beautiful. But in the work of Indigenous people, you see land living. And so the land itself is voiced because it's living and it has agency and has sentience. So all of those things find their way into these repurposed forms, like the novel, like poetry, like crime fiction, like plays. So there's been a real kind of taking over and transformation of literature in the hands of Aboriginal people.
Thank you. Just sitting here reflecting on those pieces, and from my perspective as someone whose role is to represent Australia overseas and create a dialogue with communities here in India, whether that be cultural, whether that be about education, whether that be about trade and investment. But Australia is home to the oldest continuous culture on earth. It's also a young country, 125 years old, 1901. It's also an incredibly diverse modern country. 1 in 2 Australians were born overseas or their parents were born overseas. So when you put those 3 pieces together, a conversation in Australia about identity, history, about land is a dynamic one. It will always be a dynamic one. I think it's one incredibly important that we are always having. So the role of literature in that is to bring content, to bring identity, and to bring things out that are not, as we've discussed, are not there. And certainly when I went to school were not there. There was no Indigenous history really to be read. So I'm going to say we have just over 5 minutes left. We've done an extraordinary job to get through our range of questions that we wanted to talk through. But I'm going to ask the audience if there's anyone who would like to pose a question. And I'm going to say short questions. And I'm going to say I'd like both men and women. So can we curate it that way, please, in 5 minutes? Thank you.
Hello. Hey, hi. Sort of a difficult question to ask because Julie talked about the referendum not going through. Can you talk about if there's pushback to your work, how difficult it is, what's the broad reception, how do you deal with pushback to your work, if there is any?
No, maybe Tony should actually answer this. It's been a great privilege to sometimes be shortlisted for a major award in Australia. I was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin, and I think Tony was a judge, although we haven't spoken about that. It's a kind of a polite thing. You don't talk to judges about what went behind. But pushback? No. Actually, look, I think now Indigenous writers are celebrated, and no matter what they're saying, and some of it can be extremely confronting for people of an English background in particular, people who maybe say, my family's been on this land for 5 generations, and you think, well, my family's been on this land for 70,000 years, you know, so pushback, maybe I'm not aware of it. Actually, at this stage of life, I feel that we are celebrated. But when I was quite young and I had my first play at a major theatre company, I had appalling reviews, and it wasn't because it was a bad play, because it's still performed today, including at the University of Madras a couple of days ago, which absolutely blew my mind. I hadn't seen it for 20 years. So, I don't know, Tony, pushback.
I think that's right. Yeah, I guess there's this, you know, we get these reality checks. So there is a celebration, there is a formal celebration of Aboriginal voice. But when Australia voted on Aboriginal voice in a political sense, we voted 60-40 against it. So, you know, I'm conscious that, you know, I live in something of a bubble. I teach at a university. I talk to certain kind of people. And I think there has been really moves ahead, but that there is, I think probably it is fair to say that the broader public are always suspicious that certain special treatment is being given out to Aboriginal people and so on. So that's a constant battle, I think. I think all that Indigenous authors can do is do what Julie and Philip do, which is to get out and talk to people and win hearts and minds that way.
Look, it's a miracle. It's a miracle that we don't get more racists in our sessions. I was heckled by some groupies that used to go to all of my sessions. There were 2 German women. In one of my books, my first book, the German Lutherans have a lot to answer for on how they established missions in Australia with Aboriginal communities. And these 2 women, wherever I went, they were there. But no, look, I'm amazed that I'm published at all, you know, because the white people own the presses, you know, and our work is not very pleasant for a lot of white people to read. My first book won a prize, and it was a bestseller. It sold out 5,000 in the first week. I mean, this is an amazing, it's certainly not a pushback, you know. No, it's kind of like people want to know.
Hello. Yeah. My name is Nasheed, and thank you for this wonderful talk. All 3 of you have connected to something I've gone through. I've done my master's in English at the University of Mysore. I selected Commonwealth literature as one of my specializations, and I loved the Australian part of my syllabus. But I never had the opportunity of studying Indigenous literatures, and I hope that's added as part of the curriculum. So that's one thing about recognizing their contribution, right? So that is directed to what you were talking about, Ms. Janson. And McLaren, so you talked about the myth of the settler belonging, and that really struck a chord with me, because several Indians move abroad to find a home, and all over the world, immigration is a major phenomenon today. So this myth of settling has so many variants, right? One is to subdue someone, one is to find a homeland. So I'm trying to figure out how much to take from what you've said, because it opens many, many questions.
I think Australia today, and I'm sure Hilary would concur, is that it's extraordinary because it is so diverse. We have an enormous range of human beings from all over the world. And the very first Indians came to Australia in 1830 with camels. So Indian people and Chinese people and Afghan people and Italians and Greeks have all been part of our great diaspora. And that's what makes Australia a really unusual and very successful multicultural country. So I hope you get to read literature from all of those groups.
Yes,
Xiang Lu, a young Chinese author, won the Miles Franklin. Damn. And his novel is fantastic. So, we're very multicultural, but Indigenous people have a certain set of rights and needs which sort of stand separate.
I do hope their works are included in the curriculum. That was my point.
No, it's a great. I think it's a great observation, and one that I will certainly take with me as I work here and meet universities and check what we can encourage. But I'm going to have to say that might be our concluding point. We're out of time. I've actually had I've had the in the best possible way the evil eye. It tells me so. I think we may have to suggest if you have a question off stage and do it that way.
Just a quick,
Yeah, we're not running away. We're going to be around here. So
let's have a chat off stage. With my respect to the organisers, this is a big and complex festival. So thank you very much. Honoured to share the stage with you, Julie, Tony, and Philip. Thank you so much.